My name is Ben, and it is a pleasure for me to host this episode of The Story Of. Today, I am happy to bring you an episode that is particularly close to my heart. So sit back, grab a protein drink or bottle of DX water, and join me as we talk about Brickroad and, yes, Dungeon Man.
If you've played Earthbound, you are very familiar with him. He not only helps our heroes, but he is also on a journey of his own, and we get to experience his rise to success firsthand. He is the Dungeon Man known by many, but his full story is only hinted at a few interactions along the way. In order to fully understand the man Dungeon, we must first take a step back in time and remember him as the man that started it all, Brickroad. Here is his story as we know it. It all started more than 10 years before our heroes gathered to take on Gaius, in a little place called Winters in Foggyland. The sleepy winter town is home to a prestigious boarding school called Snowwood, and it is in that school that our friend Brickroad meets a man that will change his life forever, Dr. Andonuts. Dr. Andonuts had received quite a lot of notoriety for being the first leader of the Ultra Science Club years before, and he's now tenured professor at the boarding school. One day, as Dr. Andonuts was finishing his latest project, the Instant Revitalization Machine, another member of the staff by the name of Brickroad pops his head in his lab to check the progress. What does it do?
Well, I'll show you. First you climb in, then I push some buttons and voila! It's like you've had a full night's sleep.
That's incredible. Brickroad was aware of Dr. Andonuts' intelligence, but never knew just what he was capable of building. With his recent discovery, he returned to his room and organized his files. He too had been working on a project of his own. Brickroad was very passionate about creating mazes with obstacles throughout, then the user would try to solve. He called them dungeons, and they quickly became an obsession. He knew how to lay them out perfectly on paper, but his lack of funding and direction led to dead end after dead end, pun intended. He knew that if he was to be taken seriously, he would have to create the ultimate dungeon, something that would revolutionize the way adventurers looked at mazes. A week later, he met up with Dr. Andonuts with a plan. It'll be me.
What?
I'll be the dungeon. They spent hours going over plans, rewriting ideas, scrapping puzzles, and developing ideas more. Dr. Andonuts was a genius and loved a challenge, but he needed more data. Finally, it was decided. Dr. Andonuts would fund a simple maze for Brickroad to construct to see how to strategize the next step. Elated his plan was advancing, Brickroad gathered supplies and local wildlife, including the worthless protoplasm, which oddly enough was created accidentally by Dr. Andonuts' lab, and has since been spotting oozing around the forests of Winters. With its inhabitants loaded and the wall set up, it was time to put his maze to the test. While the construction of the dungeon was underway, Dr. Andonuts left the boarding school to start construction of his own science lab, free from the rules and constraints of the boarding school. In the process, he casually leaves his son Jeff, who was just an infant at the time, to be looked after by the staff. Science was the only important thing to him, and he was on the cusp of inventing something never seen before. Little is known about Jeff's mother, but upon review of the people of Winters, the only woman we encounter is one who gives the piece of bubblegum for the monkey. Now honestly, she's kind of looker, so good for Dr. A. Over the next decade, Brickroad's first dungeon was complete, and he spent day after day coaxing travelers to walk through and give feedback on how it can improve. Tweaks were made where they were needed, and ultimately he was ready to present a plan to his scientist friend. He was at a crossroad. No matter how he reconfigured his dungeon, no matter how many creatures or presents he added, it seemed that the element that was lacking was adventure. You can't conquer a jungle from a textbook. You can't learn piano by reading a manual. You need to get your hands dirty. You need to cover ground. And that's exactly what Brickroad needed to become what a dungeon man represented. He would have to travel to caves, behind waterfalls, through harsh terrains to perfect the next step. Lucky for him, Dr. Andonuts' recent invention was a Skyrunner, a fusion-powered spacecraft that could cover far distances, and it was time to put it to work. The next step would take some time. For Brickroad, he was going to put some mileage in his shoes, but more importantly, Dr. Andonuts needed to start work on what would ultimately be his magnum opus, the ability to create a chimera, something that had never been done before. A chimera is an organism that contains a mixture of genetically different parts, in this case, a man and a dungeon. Dr. Andonuts would eventually use the technology to help a certain villain create an unthinkable atrocities. but that's a story for a different time. Brickroad abandoned his first maze and boarded the Skyrunner. It was time for the fun part. Once in the Skyrunner, he selected the first location, which Dr. Andonuts programmed into the controls. He was off to Saturn Valley. He traveled from Foggyland, across the ocean to Eagleland, and settled down off the grid among the Mr. Saturn, who were friends of Dr. Andonuts. His goal of this trip was to gather creatures to occupy his dungeon's body and add challenge. They offered him a couple of their native wildlife, a mad duck, as well as a lonely, slimy little pile that was found in the outskirts of town. I'd like to note that these events took place before the Mr. Saturn were enslaved by Master Belch, and the pile didn't seem to pose a threat. After some encouragement and a refresh, Brickroad climbed back into the Skyrunner and jetted off to his next destination. One would prove to not be as kind. He landed the Skyrunner on the outskirts of the Dusty Dunes Desert, as to not be spotted by too many people. It was there he had an eye-opening and humbling experience. Back home in Winters, his biggest threats were slow-moving goats and perhaps a cave boy. But here, he was quickly overwhelmed by a cute little UFO that promptly greeted him with a beam to the face. Luckily, he was able to incapacitate it and load it in the Skyrunner, but at a cost. He needed energy to revitalize himself. He made his way to Fourside and into the first establishment he could find, Jackie's Cafe. It was there his adventure continued to get weirder. Behind the counter, which he explored for some reason, under the control of the Manny statue, Brickroad was transported to Moonside, where the fever dream awarded him the enraged fireplug, as well as Dolly's clock, enemies he could not pass up. He was able to escape the hallucination by pure luck, maybe an exit mouse, and while he was still in Fourside, grabbed a mystical record and scalding cup of coffee from the department store. Dazed, worn down, and defeated, he made his way back to the Skyrunner. He had compiled the necessary creatures to inhabit his dungeon and more knowledge of the outside world. It's unknown how long Dungeon Man's journey took, but during that time, Dr. Andonuts was able to develop the technology to fuse Brickroad into the Dungeon Man. Though he had not completely mastered the tech, he felt comfortable enough to try it on a living being. It wouldn't be until several years later that the technology was truly complete. Brickroad returned to Dr. Andonuts, presented him with his findings, signed the appropriate waivers, and laid on the operation table. It's a shame there's no notes taken about the actual procedure. I'm sure it was an amazing thing to witness. But this is how our team assumed it went. The final touch was placing Brickroad's face and consciousness inside the top of the tower so that he could view the world around him. Though it was a bit clunky to maneuver, he was content with his new body. As the Dungeon Man, his structure consists of 4 floors, entangled with maze-like passageways and obstacles. He included several goodnight benches, which used the technology of the instant revitalization machine, which would heal the user almost instantly. On top of his challenges, he added his signature signs as a dose of charm, sprinkling words of encouragement and life lessons to help those exploring. After years of dreaming and working toward his goal, Dungeon Man was finally created. But there was a big question. Where would he go to ensure that he would be best utilized? Dungeon Man thought long and hard before deciding on the perfect answer. He remembered his worldly journey and the places he saw. The most exciting place he could think of that posed the most threats and had the most adventure tied up in it was, of course, a desert. Dusty Dunes showed him that deserts were a new beast to young explorers. But he had also recently heard of a greater desert, one that had more history, but less traffic. Just south of Scaraba would be ideal. Reachable, yet not easily accessible. Only true adventurers would be able to reach him there. And it's there that he was dropped and waited for explorers. Eventually, he saw the familiar face of Jeff, who had a few friends with him this time around. He could tell this group was destined for great adventure and wanted to help as much as possible. And when they needed additional support through the harsh landscape, he obliged by following them. Unfortunately for Dungeon Man, his massive size was no match for a set of palm trees. He became wedged between them, and that's where he stood for the rest of his active years.
The Dungeon Man continued to test those who found him. Legend says some of the locals would challenge each other by exploring the inner workings. Little is known what happened to the Brickroad. Though he was fused to the dungeon, he most likely succumbed to his mortality eventually. But his creator never forgot about him. Whether it be transporting or replicating, the legacy of Brickroad and Dungeon Man lived on in museum nowhere. This has been a special presentation of the story of Dungeon Man and Brickroad. Feel free to leave your own experience below or add a little more to the story if we've missed something. It's always fun to piece together a whole story when only a small portion of the details are there. Before I sign off, here is a clever perspective that Redditor Talis Merlin shared regarding Dungeon Man. In a way, Dungeon Man is the JRPG fan within a JRPG. He loves dungeons. Building dungeons and then becoming one allowed for a meta commentary on design. It's an act of love, and anyone who creates something like a JRPG probably identifies with their work, at least a little bit. Dungeon Man takes that to the extreme and becomes what he loves. And with that, I tell ya, later days. Hey guys, Ben here. I'm just wondering if you like the format of this video. I was trying something new, a little long-winded, little story of. If you're a fan of it, let me know and I'll make more like it. If it wasn't your cup of tea, let me know and maybe I'll switch it up for the next bunch. So, thanks for watching this way through. Like, subscribe if you haven't. Let me know what you thought of the video and we'll see you next time.